Good evening. Let me make some adjustments here. Kurt's playing with things, I think. Welcome to the Bradford County Historical Society, and a few announcements before we get started. The museum continues to be open and Wednesday through Friday, and also the research library, so feel free to come in and tour the museum. We still have our 150th anniversary exhibit upstairs for you to check out on the history of the Historical Society and what has been accomplished over that time. And so tonight's program, back, I think it was a year ago, we had a marker dedication over here in front of the courthouse, and our speaker was there that day, and we got to talking about David Wilmot, and turns out that he has done quite a bit of research on David Wilmot over the years, and so it was interesting to find someone outside of the county that had done quite a bit on him. So our speaker this evening is Dr. William Lewis, Jr., and he's managing principal and portfolio manager at Lewis, Lewinsky and Associates in Wilkes-Barre. He's a board member and past president of the Luzerne County Historical Society. And among other positions, he served as a commissioner of the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission since 2011, and one of his roles there is on the commission is as chair of the State Historical Marker Selection Panel. And so he's here tonight to talk about the amazing life and political career of David Wilmot. So come at this time.
So in my role in the commission, I get to see a lot of the Historical Society museums in Pennsylvania. Frankly, this is the first time, even though we live so close, that I've had the opportunity to see this. I am totally blown away. You guys are to be so congratulated of taking space that most people would say, what in heaven's name are we going to do with this? And turning it into this fabulous museum. I mean, just the stories and all the things that you can tell about this. This is amazing. I am just absolutely amazed by what you've done here. All the members of the society here should be very, very proud. This is a terrific, terrific museum. So congratulations. With that, however, as we were walking in, Matt said to me, this is the exercise courtyard here. And he said, actually, 3 people were executed here. He said, that was until a few months back when we had a Friday night program and we had a really bad speaker. So now I'm just a little nervous. By the way, if I choke up, it's not because I'm in the middle of my summer hay fever meltdown, so I can't breathe half the time. My poor wife over there, she puts all these pillows over my head at night. I don't know what it's, I think it's to stop me coughing. But anyway, so a couple of years ago, I started doing some research on Abraham Lincoln and his friends and his foes in what was then Luzerne County, which at the time he was president constituted both current-day Luzerne as well as Lackawanna County. And I started trying to identify some of his friends, and we had a guy in Congress who was very close to Lincoln when he was in Congress for his one term as well. And then we have some enemies, such as George Washington Woodward, our state's Chief Justice during the Civil War, who just did everything he could to vex Lincoln. But one of the people I uncovered who spent a little bit of time in the Wyoming Valley in Wilkes-Barre was David Wilmot. And so I'll tell you about that. And actually his wife is from Wilkes-Barre. Her parents owned and operated a very famous tavern of the day there. It was called Ornt's Tavern. It was right on South River Street in Wilkes-Barre. And just shortly before their ownership of that tavern, the future King of France, coming back from French asylum, stayed in Wilkes-Barre at the tavern for about 2 weeks. So it's a very storied building that was moved in the 40s and was destroyed in the 1972 flood. The 50th anniversary is coming up. So I'll start that. I use a lot of slides, but I apologize. There will be periods of time where we're kind of stuck on a slide because it's kind of difficult finding pictures that are true to the whole time period that I'm talking about. But I did what I hope is my best. So here we go. The temperature in the city of Washington was incredibly hot on Saturday, August 8th, 1846. In those years, long before any kind of formal weather reports, newspapers generally made just a single casual comment about the previous day's overall weather condition. But that day, or the next day I should say, the temperature outside in Washington was scalding hot. But so too was the heat of politics in the U.S. Capitol building, where it was even hotter. And this, of course, I'm talking the city of Washington and the U.S. Capitol with the Bullfinch Copper Dome. If you've ever been to the Wyoming Valley and seen the Wyoming Monument, the current dome was designed by the same guy who designed the fancy dome that's on the U.S. Capitol right now. On Saturday afternoon, one of the greatest and most critical volleys in the fight against slavery was fired by a Pennsylvania congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, it was surprising, for his legislative career up until that moment has been described as unremarkable, and some even called him listless. Yet the legislator making that grand assault on slavery was David Wilmot, a Democrat representing the 12th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, who rose not only to offer an amendment to a funding bill that President James Polk, who had sought legislation designed to assist the U.S. government in negotiating a boundary border with Mexico as the Mexican-American War wound down. Now, when Wilmot spoke, he offered an amendment to prohibit the introduction of slavery into any of the new territories acquired as a result of the recent conflict with Mexico. His idea caused an instant stir and what a Washington newspaper modestly described as, quote, a good deal of confusion prevailing, unquote. History has never determined Wilmot's true motives. Did he foresee his proposed amendment would cause such a firestorm in the nation's capital, or that it would forever alter and even hasten the end of slavery in the United States? He must have realized that the immediate fights that his actions would occur. The political and philosophical fight he started helped to completely divide the nation between the pro-abolition and the pro-slavery forces. And in doing this, Wilmot unquestionably raised his profile as a politician as well as a leader in the abolition movement. He may have also simultaneously caused his own long-term political demise as an electable candidate at the congressional, statewide, and even national level. His later bid for the governorship of Pennsylvania in 1857, where a win would have assuredly placed him first in line for the Republican nomination for president in 1860, was largely destroyed because of his controversial position he had taken in 1846 with the introduction of the proviso, as well as his vote on the tariff bill. At the time of introducing what we now call the Wilmot Proviso, and later as he built the Republican Party, Wilmot was the most well-known political figure in the nation. Now, an often overlooked and even ignored actor in the movement towards abolition and the Civil War, Wilmot showed immense political bravery and statesmanship in a day and age when political gamesmanship ran wild. At a time when the U.S. political world tried to sidestep addressing the issue of human enslavement, Wilmot put forth his proviso, one that challenged the status quo and helped to move the nation into an inevitable fight and bloodbath that finally resolved the horrors of slavery here. At the same time, it would hurt and it would limit his political ambitions. David Wilmot began his life in the very rural northeastern part of Pennsylvania in a town called Bethany, right near Honesdale, on January 20th, 1814. His parents, Randall and Mary Wilmot, were transplants to Wayne County from Connecticut, a popular move in the 18th century as the farms in New England began to find their soil overworked from decades of aggressive farming. Wilmot was educated at the Beechwoods Academy in his hometown of Bethany, where he and his family attended the Bethany Presbyterian Church. Now, among the church members was George Washington Woodward, his future legal mentor and inductor into the world of Democratic Party politics. Personally close and politically mutually supportive for many years, Wilmot and Woodward would later grow philosophically apart as Woodward moved to the ultra-conservative end of the Democratic Party, veering towards a pro-slavery, pro-Southern stance, which many regarded as the Copperhead ideology. Give you an example. In 1860, right after Lincoln was elected, Judge Woodward went to a rally on Independence Square in Philadelphia and said, "I see nothing wrong with slavery because Jesus himself never spoke against it." And he also suggested at the same rally that Pennsylvania should secede from the Union and join the South. So he was a little extreme in his opinions. Higher education was afforded to very few people in the early 19th century, but Wilmot was quite fortunate. He went on to attend the Cayuga Lake Academy in Aurora, New York. He left the academy when he's 18 years old and entered into the Wilkes-Barre Law Office of Woodward to read law. That is Judge Woodward. The building was taken down in 1978. I suspect this is a picture from the early 50s. Those are not David Wilmot's cars. Okay, I'm kidding. But at least there was a picture. I actually worked as a kid in the library right across the street and watched them demolish that building. Wilmot, apparently from appearances, was a less than stellar student of the law, and Woodward, together with his law office associates, considered dismissing him for their tutelage. Instead, they gave Wilmot a chance to show his knowledge of the law, or lack thereof, through a thorough examination. As the lawyers quizzed him on the increasingly complex areas of legal issues and knowledge, Wilmot's skills and expertise absolutely shined. They decided to allow Wilmot to remain as a student, letting him fulfill the absolute minimum amount of time needed to study to take the bar exam. Determined to follow in a career of both law and politics, Wilmot set out to begin his career. After reading law in several other law offices, Woodward presented Wilmot to the bar for admission in August of 1834. At age 20, Wilmot became an attorney. A month later, he decided to move to Towanda, where he proceeded to open his law office, seeking greater opportunities for legal work as well as political involvement in the rural north of central Pennsylvania. Within months of his arrival in his new town, Wilmot had quickly involved himself in local Democratic politics. By 1835, he was quickly becoming a sought-after political speaker as well as an author of editorials and then popular political resolutions. His time of reading law in Wilkes-Barre had been a time where he fell in love with the local tavern owner's daughter. In 1836, he married Anna Morgan, and the couple would go on to have 4 children. As a family man, his image as a rising county leader was secured, and his community and political activity rapidly grew. His work as a lawyer gave him the flexibility to pursue politics and the polished writing and speaking skills that made him an attractive figure in the very rural parts of this state where he had chosen to live and work. By 1841, Wilmot's political work had finally brought him rewards. He was named as the assistant to the superintendent of the Tioga branch of the North Branch Canal, a state position which carried with it a salary as well as significant privilege of giving out patronage public works jobs to those who politically supported him. He also served as a delegate to the state Democratic Convention, which nominated the party's gubernatorial candidate. By September of 1841, he had become the chair of this county's Democratic Party Standing Committee. In effect, he was the Democratic chair of Bradford County. And by 1842, he was urged to run for Congress. He waited a while. In 1844, he was ready to make his serious run for Congress. The Pennsylvania counties of Bradford, Susquehanna, and Tioga, which constituted the 12th congressional district, were ready to support his candidacy. The citizens of the district voted for Wilmot as their representative in Congress, electing him by a margin of more than 3,000 votes. And given the size of congressional districts, that was a huge, huge mandate. The significance of Wilmot's victory immediately placed him in the spotlight as a Democratic leader. There were suggestions that Wilmot should quickly scale the political ladder and serve in the U.S. Senate to fill the upcoming vacancy that was being created when incumbent Pennsylvania Senator James Buchanan was in line to become the new Secretary of State through appointment by the incoming President, James Polk. However, the Pennsylvania legislature, who then had the constitutional power to elect senators, instead appeared to favor Wilmot's old legal preceptor for office, and a solid Democratic caucus voted to place the name of none other than George Washington Woodward as the official candidate for the Senate seat. Now, Wilmot was delighted by this, but when the final vote came in Harrisburg, his fellow Democrat, Simon Cameron, was officially elected. Now, Simon Cameron was from Lancaster, and then in Harrisburg, he was a character. He was your ultimate political arranger. By the way, his legacy, his son served as senator. They basically controlled Pennsylvania for 50 to 60 years. So a long political legacy with one family. Diplomatically, even before the official vote was taken on the Senate seat, Wilmot sought to make political amends with what they called him the wily Cameron. In late 1844, Wilmot wrote to him to advise that while some of the people had wanted Wilmot himself to seek the office of Senate, he knew that Cameron would make a much more capable senator. Despite his attempts to befriend Cameron, Wilmot would find that this very skilled political manipulator, a formidable foe of his in many issues for years to come. Wilmot would also begin to suspect that James Buchanan had also had a direct hand in ensuring Cameron's election. In this case, fearing that the political movement of political power away from the South to the north and central part of Pennsylvania. This was a theme that would play over and over and over. A lot of people were Philadelphia was not as much of a power seat as you would think. Pittsburgh was a very small town at that time. The political power in Pennsylvania at the time was south central Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Harrisburg, that area. And many people were convinced that that political power was going to shift up here, largely because of David Wilmot. Although Wilmot was elected in the fall of 1844, it was not until December 1st, 1845, that Congress officially convened for its first session. After 1 week in Congress, Wilmot was appointed to the House Standing Committee on Manufacturers, a committee that was chaired by former U.S. President John Quincy Adams, who was now in his post-White House years and was a member of the House of Representatives representing Massachusetts. Wilmot's early actions in Congress really gave little indication of his future actions against slavery. In one of his earliest votes in Congress, he supported a resolution that it would have restored a ban on any discussion relating to slavery in the House chamber. That was the chamber that Wilmot actually served in. A rule that had been ended in several previous congressional sessions and was defeated during this vote. Wilmot's vote in favor of a measure placed him squarely on the same side of many congressmen who would later loudly and violently oppose the Wilmot proviso that he would offer. Wilmot would also strongly favor the admission of Texas to the United States and would have a hand in blocking the amendment made to Texas's admission that would have prohibited slavery in the state. While his legislative behavior may now be seen as bizarre in light of his future advocacy of the proviso, he was first and foremost an expert in the law, and he may well have deferred the idea of states' rights in taking the side of pro-slavery forces in this case. Texas had previously, on its own as a separate nation or republic, allowed slavery, so it was an already existing institution in that state. But it was to leave many of his colleagues later in great disbelief. Wilmot's legislative activity often echoed his less than impressive years as a law student. It's been noted that in his congressional career, while Wilmot may have been very active in behind-the-scenes political work, his official actions within the House up until the time of the proviso were few. He introduced a measure to give a Revolutionary War soldier a pension increase and brought forth 2 resolutions to establish direct postal routes in his own congressional district. But the records of Congress from the era called the Congressional Globe show little other official activity other than votes. Wilmot was totally committed to keeping in touch with his constituents, and in the days before congressional staffers, he was consumed in corresponding with people back here in the district. He'd impressed his fellow House members with his powerful voice and strong convictions, but he also showed them another side, and a number of them described him as slovenly dressed, careless, and even listless. As 1846 began, an incident occurred in the U.S. Senate that may have shaken Wilmot to the core. In late 1845, President James Polk nominated, once again, Wilmot's old legal mentor, George Washington Woodward, to a vacant seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. On Christmas night, fellow Pennsylvania, now Secretary of State, James Buchanan, visited Polk at the White House to express his anger at the president for having made a nomination without consulting him. Polk personally had been upset by Woodward's defeat in the Pennsylvania Senate for the Pennsylvania Senate seat and believed that Woodward was a solid Democrat from a strict legal constructionist school, which he was now seeking in his new Supreme Court nominee. But Buchanan was angry, thinking that Polk had personally hurt him and his fellow South Central Pennsylvanian Simon Cameron, who considered Woodward a rival. Buchanan quickly backed away from his strident stance with Polk as the president recounted the many patronage appointments he had made at Buchanan's request. On January 22, 1846, the Senate took up a vote on the Woodward nomination, defeating him with the entire Whig Party caucus being joined by 6 Democrats in the Senate, including none other than Pennsylvania's Simon Cameron and 2 of Buchanan's close friends. Polk was furious, and rumors swirled around Washington that Buchanan had sought Woodward's defeat not only as political revenge, but that Buchanan himself really wanted the Supreme Court post. Another Pennsylvanian, Vice President George M. Dallas, stopped by the White House to report that Cameron had been the ringleader for the defeat. And shortly thereafter, the Buchanan Senate friends began to lobby the president for Buchanan's nomination to the court post. But Polk made it very clear that Buchanan would never be his nominee. And as for Wilmot, his friend and former mentor Woodward had been defeated, and it was another signal that Buchanan-Cameron forces were not going to allow the political clout of South Central Pennsylvania to drift northward. Now, the use of tariffs to tax and even reduce the inflow of foreign goods in the United States had been a very popular practice in the early days of the nation, where politicians and the public sought ways to hinder foreign imports that they saw were destroying domestic jobs and commerce. In 1846, the Polk administration sought a uniform tariff reduction, believing that standard tariff fees would not only increase domestic business, but also increase federal tax revenues. The measure was controversial but had solid Democratic backing, except in Pennsylvania, where the state legislature had gone on record to oppose any of these changes. In its earliest defiance of his own party, Wilmot was the sole Democrat from Pennsylvania to support the tariff bill. In his strongly protectionist home district here, his vote was not popular, but to Wilmot, his decision was a matter of principle and pure economic reality. It was an example of him taking a stance despite the political consequences. Yet his greatest moment of fame, as well as the controversy, was several months away at the very end of the first session of Congress. So both houses of Congress had set Monday, August 10th, 1846, as their day of adjournment. And so in the swiftly ending days of this session, there was unfinished business yet to be accomplished. Just before the afternoon recess, a message was read to the House of Representatives from President James Polk. In it, he laid out his case to seek funds needed to settle a border dispute with Mexico, money that would rapidly help to conclude the hostilities with the southern country. Polk asked for $2 million of funds that could be used by the president as an incentive to end all fighting and result in a border treaty. Much arguing ensued on how long the funding issue would be debated until a break was declared in the House proceedings. During the recess, Wilmot gathered with several anti-slavery Democrats, including Preston King and Silas Wright, men who had not only opposed slavery, but were also beginning to oppose President Polk. While the group undoubtedly talked before, it was clear that the funding request was a perfect opportunity to strike a blow at both Polk and slavery. It was decided an amendment would be offered that would exclude slavery from the territory gained as a result of the Mexican War. As the House reconvened at 5 o'clock, the debate began on the president's request. A New York Whig, Congressman Hugh White, stated that he would oppose the bill unless someone from the Democratic Party moved to prevent slavery from entering the new territory. As the debate went on, it was Wilmot's turn. He noted his support for the war and for the acquisition of Western territorial land, but added that he was opposed now and forever to allowing slavery to be established in the new American lands. With that, he offered the following amendment: provided that the express fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico by the United States by virtue of any treaty which may be negotiated between them, and to use the executive of the moneys herein, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the said territory, except for crime wherefore the party shall first be duly convicted. On the House floor, it took a while for members to grasp the significance of what occurred. The focus of the House debate had gone from a discussion on the merits of the Mexican War and the new lands it would bring to the United States to an immediate and heated fight over the issue of slavery. Slowly, House members realized what had happened. Anti-slavery congressmen began to add their voices of support to the proviso and how this amendment would make them favorable to voting in favor of the border funding bill. Former President John Quincy Adams, long an opponent of slavery as well as the Mexican War, stated he would hardly support money with the addition of Wilmot's proposal. Conversely, Southern congressmen, including Alexander Sims of South Carolina and Kentucky's Garrett Davis, expressed their outrage at what had been proposed. Now, rapidly, the House galleries filled with spectators drawn to witness the historic argument. Major political figures, such as the Secretary of State, James Buchanan, arrived at the Capitol building and positioned themselves around the House lobby. Even President Polk, who was furious over the amendment, decided to stay in the Capitol's vice president's office, where he had arrived earlier in the day with the simple intention of signing some pieces of legislation before departing. When the vote came on Wilmot's proviso, the House of Representatives passed it 83-64. The funding bill itself was passed 87-64. Now the House had accepted the bill, amended in a very serious way against slavery. It was up to the Senate to take up the bill before their scheduled recess. The next day, on Saturday, August 9th, 1846, President Polk made an entry in his personal diary. Late in the evening of Saturday the 8th, I learned that after an exciting debate in the House, a bill passed that body, but with a mischievous and foolish amendment to the effect that no territory which might be acquired by the treaty from Mexico shall ever be a slaveholding country. What connection slavery had with this making peace with Mexico is difficult to conceive. This amendment was voted onto the bill by the opponents of the measure, and when voted on, the original friends of the bill voted against it. But it was passed by the Whigs and Northern Democrats who had been opposed to making the appropriation. In this form, it had gone to the Senate. Had there been time, but there is very little doubt the Senate would have struck out the slavery proviso and the House would have concurred. On Monday, August 10, 1846, the U.S. Senate began their session, but with the knowledge that they would have to complete all the work by the scheduled adjournment of noon that day. About 1 hour before the approaching noon deadline, the body took up Polk's $2 million funding request, the approved House version of which now contained the Wilmot Amendment or proviso. Alabama Senator Dixon Lewis, chair of the Senate House Committee, led the bill's discussion. Just prior to the third and final reading of the bill, Lewis moved to strike Wilmot's newly added proviso. Various senators rose up to argue both for and against the amendment as Lewis tried to regain control of the Senate floor. He immediately pointed that noon had arrived in the House of Representatives. So despite the fact the House clock was 8 minutes ahead of the Senate clock, the House was adjourned and the members departed. Might be a good thing nowadays, but the original bill, as well as the added proviso, was effectively dead. Polk would not have access to the money he sought to negotiate with Mexico, and Wilmot's attempt to contain the expansion of slavery had been stopped. But despite the amendment's death, Wilmot had thrown down a gauntlet to end slavery. In doing so, he exposed the huge rift in the attitudes toward slavery that existed between the then president and many of the Pennsylvania voters, especially here in Wilmot's region. Yet at the same time, he had opened the opportunity for the Whig Party in his own state to use the political conflict to their advantage. Wilmot had been the lone member of Congress who had not voted against, from Pennsylvania, who had not voted against the 1846 Tariff Act. In the Senate, Wilmot's friend and fellow Pennsylvanian, Vice President George Dallas, had been the tiebreaker to vote favorably for the Senate bill. In contrast, Senator Simon Cameron, who was rapidly becoming the Democratic foe of both Wilmot and Dallas, worked particularly hard to defeat the tariff bill, helping him to earn the very favorable feelings from many Pennsylvania voters who were convinced high tariffs helped to create and maintain domestic employment. The rift simmered and then finally came to a political boil within several years. Meantime, Wilmot continued to push his proviso, and he also faced re-election in 1846. So his 1846 run for the House, again, looked like he would be in political trouble. There were several Democratic conventions here in the county. The local official Bradford County Democratic Party renominated him, as well as did Tioga and Susquehanna counties. Their votes were unanimous, and when they had a district-wide convention, they all voted to renominate him. But some of his Democratic enemies continued to fight him. There were self-appointed committees with separate nominating conventions. Robert G. White was nominated as the official Democratic candidate by one of these. The conferees went back and forth. A lot of this, it's believed, was pushed in this area by the friends of James Buchanan. In the October 13th election, Wilmot won re-election by a majority of almost 800 votes. Another 2-year term in Congress gave him the opportunity to push the proviso. So he continued to toil on this. There was a time period when he was in this term in office where he repeatedly reintroduced the Wilmot proviso and tried to tag that on to virtually any measure that was going through the House. The measure didn't survive in any form in the Senate, where Southern presence was more powerful in real numbers as well as in influence. Now, President Polk finally did get his appropriation. By then, he had raised the amount to $3 million, and this law was enabled without Wilmot's amendment. So the work of the 29th Congress was done, and he was once again up for re-election. He returned here to the district in March of 1847. He had found that his vote on the tariff bill had somewhat preoccupied the people of the community, but slowly it was becoming a somewhat forgotten issue. On February 13, 1847, the Bradford Reporter noted that, quote, Mr. Wilmot had more to apprehend from the hostility of his colleagues than any other cause. A malign disposition is at work to crush him, confined to Pennsylvania. Again, this was Cameron, this was Buchanan using the tentacles of their power. By April of that year, discussion of the proviso was filling editorial boards and news columns, not only here in his congressional district, but around the entire nation. Wilmot Proviso leagues began to be established in many free states, and mass meetings and conventions advocating opposition to the proviso flourished in the U.S. South. Even Salmon P. Chase, in his autobiographical sketch, said the agitation of the Wilmot Proviso, instead of decreasing, actually began to increase. In spring of 1848, it appeared destined to be the controlling issue of the next presidential campaign. Here's how widespread Wilmot's effect was. In July 1847, the Georgia State Democratic Convention passed a resolution that would guarantee that it would not support any presidential candidate who would declare himself not in complete opposition to the proviso. So you can see it had nationwide impact in virtually every part of the country. In 1848, the opposing Whig Party candidate, General Zachary Taylor, also did not support any part of the proviso. Taylor noted that the Wilmot Proviso is more bugbear and amounts to nothing. That's a quote. It's gotten up to produce some important effect for the moment in certain quarters and will soon die away and be looked on as a 7-day wonder. Now, I find this part very fascinating. All of his attention and the fervor that Wilmot put into his work really put him in the bullseye of politics, resulting in very heavy attacks on him. Government mail route advertising had become an important source of income for 19th century newspapers, and very quickly newspapers that had supported Wilmot found that their advertising had been pulled by none other than President James Polk's postmaster, this charming fellow, Cave Johnson, giving the advertising to other newspapers which had not supported Wilmot. One of the newspapers that began to benefit from the government-controlled advertising was, quote, described as a obscure little sheet of limited circulation in a small county, further noting that, quote, for the purpose of giving information to the public, Mr. Johnson, the Postmaster General, might have as well had the advertisement copied in Chinese and stuck up on a pine tree in Potter County. Direct quote. The editor of the Bradford Reporter, looking for an explanation as to why their advertising had ended, was told by the Postmaster General that he was not considered as he was a proviso man. That's how out and out mean they were. Now, again, most of the retribution against Wilmot was led by James Buchanan, who had blocked Wilmot's nomination of a person to become the local federal prosecuting attorney. Even when James Polk himself was angered by, or President Polk was angered by Buchanan's political trickery, Wilmot's nominee for the postmaster post of the U.S. Army was defeated in the Senate, clearly through the mutual cooperation of Buchanan and Cameron. In 1847, Wilmot had began to see his own party was often working against him. He attended the Herkimer Convention later that year, where he prominently helped plant the seeds for a new political party, the Free Soil Party. Another political turning point for him occurred as the 30th Congress was convening. He was joined in that congressional session by a man who would serve for a single term, yet their lives would completely intersect. The new congressman, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. While the record shows that Wilmot was clearly more active in floor debates and committee work in the new congressional session, he was much quieter about taking big positions on matters of national debate. Yet, he was bringing about major changes in the American political landscape as he rallied advocates for free soil politics. As expected, newspapers in the area gave constant reports that his district had repudiated him because of his proviso notions. In February of 1848, a mass Democratic meeting was held here in Towanda to challenge the constant newspaper criticism. This convention not only adopted a resolution of confidence in Wilmot, but also elected him as their delegate to the state party convention. Attempts to disrupt his own re-election bid continued, but in October of 1848, he regained his local popularity and won his congressional seat for a third term by his largest margin ever. 1848, December, the Congress convenes in Washington, but a new party name is added to the official congressional roster. Besides the Democratic and Whig Party, a new party designation, the Free Soil Party, was noted, naming about a dozen members of the party. Prominent was the name of David Wilmot. As the Congress reconvened, a huge fight began to emerge over the election of the House Speaker. Wilmot was nominated as a candidate for that post, but attracting almost all of the Free Soil Party members, he drew few other congressmen in his support as they feared their state party machines might turn against them. Again, this was another tense session of Congress. Quickly, Wilmot's own Free Soil Democrats named him as their candidate for the 1850 election, but he saw that his time in Congress was probably drawing to a close. So actually at that point, from this area, you guys elected Susquehanna County's Goshela Grow. Now, Grow would go on to serve, at least for the first 2 years of the Lincoln presidency, as a Speaker of the House of Representatives. So, very interesting. He left Congress. In the fall of 1851, at a Bradford County convention, Wilmot was nominated to be the president judge of Pennsylvania's 13th Judicial District, which was made up of Bradford, Sullivan, and Susquehanna counties. The competing Whig power never nominated anyone to run against him. Yet the political forces running against Wilmot came up with an independent candidate to run against him just a few days before the election. Nonetheless, he was elected and began his term as the district's president judge in December of 1851. He quickly became a respected jurist known for his integrity and honesty. But in a day and age before the judiciary in Pennsylvania still could not, well, now you can't be involved in politics, but you could be heavily involved in partisan politics at that time. Wilmot was able to continue his political activity, and during his time on the bench, he established and helped to build the emerging Republican Party in Pennsylvania. As the 1850s unfolded, politics was changing across America. American political parties had tried to, some of them having tried to remain philosophically neutral to gain the most number of supporters, but they were quickly devolving into very specific policy-driven. The ideology behind the pursuit of harmony within the parties was gone. The Southern Whigs dissolved over to the Democratic Party, the Free Soil Party that had emerged for those opposed to slavery. That political entity quickly merged into the Republican Party. Wilmot was quickly becoming even more radical in his political positions versus the mainstream conservative Democratic Party. At the time, the Northern Whig Party rapidly was dissolving into the Republican Party, a political reorganization that was attracting many unhappy Democrats, many of whom felt displaced by the Democratic leadership of the 1840s. In 1854, incumbent Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, William Bigler, was defeated by Whig James Pollock. Wilmot's former congressional district delivered one of the biggest majority votes for Pollock in the entire state. It was clear that Wilmot was changing his party direction. In 1855, the new Republican Party formed in Pennsylvania. At the state executive committee convention and meeting in September, a party chairman was named, David Wilmot. In February of 1856, an informal national convention was called together in Pittsburgh to organize the National Party, one that could possibly field a candidate for the presidency later that year. That gathering led to the first Republican convention held in Philadelphia in June of 1856. Each state had a representative on the National Executive Committee, with David Wilmot as Pennsylvania's member. The convention itself was organized into two things. First, to select a candidate for the White House, and just as critically, to prepare and put forth a party platform that would help establish a clear philosophical statement as well as practical guidelines for what the party stood for and what its potential elected officials would do in office. Wilmot was selected to chair the platform committee. The platform that he and his committee put together was well received by the convention delegates and naturally included a strong provision calling for the end of slavery in all of the nation's new territories. The new party named John Fremont as their presidential candidate, and he faced veteran politician James Buchanan in the fall race. While Buchanan won both the statewide race in Pennsylvania as well as the national elections, in northern Pennsylvania, in Wilmot's old congressional district, right here, Fremont won the local vote by more than 4,000 votes. Wilmot's influence at home was still strong. In 1857, Wilmot was in yet another campaign for office. This time, he was the party's candidate for the governor of Pennsylvania. In March 1857, Republican delegates gathered to pick their party candidate on the second ballot, which was rare to have that few ballots. Wilmot was selected to run. At a time, an influential North American publication described him as a Republican, pure and simple. He resigned his judgeship in an agreement with both the incumbent governor as well as the man he intended to appoint to replace Wilmot. The new appointee agreed to resign the post should Wilmot fail to win the governorship. In the summer of 1857, Wilmot began an aggressive speaking and campaign schedule that took him to every part of the state, one of the first governor candidates to do so. While many saw Wilmot's efforts as hopeless from the start, he used his candidacy not only to promote himself, but also to bring the new Republican Party message to the people of the Commonwealth. In delivering and explaining Republican ideals, he was hugely successful, but in getting votes for himself, he was less so. Facing a Democratic Party opponent who used Wilmot's past positions on the tariff as well as his advocacy for free soil politics, his campaign was quickly undermined. He faced not only voters who disliked the stance he had taken in the past, but also a press influenced by his longtime opponents. Typical was the opinion of the Lancaster Intelligencer, which described the election choice as between a native Pennsylvanian, William F. Packer, and a New York free trade and abolition agitator, David Wilmot. Well, we know he only went to school for a while in New York, who is ignorant of the business and politics of the state. Shortly before the election, the impact of the nationwide financial panic of 1857 was hit. In Philadelphia, as well as other large cities of Pennsylvania, banks stopped paying for their own currency and charters were revoked. Businesses across the state failed, and as the voting public, Wilmot was seen as the weaker candidate to handle the crisis. Wilmot was defeated for office, winning only 20 of the state's 65 counties. In Philadelphia, he received less than a quarter of the votes. So his future as a presidential candidate was pretty much at the time dashed by that. Within weeks of his defeat, outgoing Governor Pollock followed through with his commitment to appoint Wilmot back to his judicial post, an appointment that would have been effective for just 1 year when he would have had to run anyway to stay in office. Although he resumed his role as the district president judge, Wilmot's political enemies were at work to try and undermine him. With a Democratic governor and legislature now in control, attempts were made to break up the 13th Judicial District, trying to move his home county into the 26th Judicial District while moving the adjacent Susquehanna County into the 11th. To further hurt Wilmot, members of the state legislature also proposed making charges against him that brought about to try and bring about his removal from office. Both initiatives, thanks to a number of local judges, were completely destroyed, and he was retained in his judicial post by more than 2/3 of the vote. In 1860, Wilmot's greatest political enemy, James Buchanan, was happily leaving the White House. In January, New York Senator Preston King and Michigan Senator K.S. Bingham visited Wilmot at his Towanda home to talk about how the Republican Party could win the presidency. In May of that year, Judge Wilmot headed to the National Republican Convention in Chicago, where he was named temporary convention chair. He carefully guided the Pennsylvania delegation to supporting Lincoln, and with his help, when his help was needed to gain other support, he gave up the chairmanship so he could personally lobby for Lincoln's candidacy with other delegations. In fact, it was in Wilmot's hotel room that a key agreement was made that helped Lincoln gain the Republican nomination. Lincoln was deeply grateful for Wilmot's efforts and support, and he invited the Pennsylvania Republican to visit him in Springfield, Illinois, soon after his election. The press who was covering the new president-elect quickly began to report that Wilmot was headed for a major post in Lincoln's cabinet. As the media speculated as to whether he would fill the secretary post at the Treasury of the War Department, another report, of course, came out that none other than Simon Cameron had arrived in Springfield shortly thereafter to visit with Lincoln. A masterful politician and even better manipulator, a person who frequently had vexed Wilmot, Cameron became there to seek a cabinet post for himself. Soon the press was reporting that Wilmot had advised Lincoln that he thought himself better suited for service in the Senate, and that if he wanted to fill Cameron's seat, Cameron going to the cabinet, he would become the state senator. Now, Wilmot's family claimed for years they had seen letters from Lincoln definitely offering the judge a cabinet position. In the end, some sort of quiet political deal must have been arranged where Cameron became the Secretary of War, and Wilmot, through Cameron's powerfully controlled Pennsylvania legislature, was to fill the 2 remaining terms of Cameron's term in the U.S. Senate. In March of 1861, as the Lincoln's cabinet assembled, Wilmot was elected by the Pennsylvania legislature to serve in the U.S. Senate. Now, as the Union began to rapidly break up, a bold move was made to try to stem the collapse of the nation as southern states began to remove themselves from the United States through secession. A peace conference with delegations from each state from the North and South was called to prevent a national disaster, and the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, named Wilmot as Pennsylvania's peace commissioner. Now, Wilmot survived a planned kidnapping attempt, arriving in Washington only to find the peace conference was rapidly falling apart, ending any chance of keeping America as one country. In 1861, until the term ended at the end of 1862, when Democratic Charles Buckalew from Bloomsburg replaced him in the Senate seat, Wilmot was a solid and consistent supporter of Lincoln and his administration. Wilmot could also be counted on to support Pennsylvania's Republican governor, Andrew Curtin, who was a very close ally of Lincoln. Lincoln's recognition of his loyalty came in March of 1863 when he named Wilmot to the newly created U.S. Court of Claims, which was a second, right below the U.S. Supreme Court, a court of national jurisdiction with a lifetime appointment to handle claims against the federal government. It said that Wilmot had finally decided that he needed financial security and benefits for his family. Now, early in his federal judicial career, he was frequently lauded for his soundness of his judicial opinions and legal reasoning. But as time in office continued, the phrase Wilmot, J, which Wilmot judge, did not take part in this decision, becomes a frequently noted addendum to much of the court's dockets. Questions about Wilmot's health abounded. On March 16, 1868, he died at his Bradford County home here in Towanda, back in his judicial and congressional district where he had long served. This is a guy who had a major impact on America. And if you go back and look at textbooks, public school textbooks on American history 50, 100 years ago, there was a lot of stuff in there about the Wilmot Proviso. I had the chance to see a public school history textbook about 2 years ago, and it's down to a quarter page or absent. And it's really sad because this is a man who truly changed America, who really, who stood up at a time for many things when a lot of people wouldn't have the guts to do it. He, as Matt can tell you, he's also a very difficult guy to study. The most comprehensive work on him was a 1924 biography called David Wilmot Free Soiler. You can find it on Amazon and some of these other places sometimes. But even in that, this professor, Charles Buxton Going, who wrote it, said that there's very few private papers on David Wilmot. There's nothing in the Library of Congress except for some pictures. I can tell you, I searched through the state archives. There's the one single letter I referenced before that he wrote to Simon Cameron trying to make amends early in his career. The guy, you know, you really have to research him through the Congressional Globe and through newspaper clippings to really learn about his whole life. So, you know, I just hope that in his hometown where he died, where he left such a legacy, that you guys will continue to promote what he did, because he is a hugely important figure in American history, in the Civil War, and I think probably one of the most fascinating guys in Pennsylvania politics. This is a guy who essentially could have probably been the House Speaker. He probably could have been the governor of Pennsylvania. And had he done the things that the average politician would have done in that day and age, he most likely would have been the Republican presidential candidate in 1860 and would have been the president of the United States. But by doing the right things at different points in his career, he may have alienated a number of the electorate, both in his district, across the state, and across the country. So he's certainly a guy that you guys can celebrate and hopefully spawn some additional research about his life, because he is a completely fascinating character. And with that, I thank you for your patience on my little bit of a dissertation here. And Matt, do you take questions, or are we done? If there's any questions, Matt may be able to answer them as much as I can. Oh, thank you so much. One of the gentlemen here tonight brought this. He took the picture of this that he has. It's a washstand from Wilmot's home. You can see the marble. So there are pieces of his legacy. Does the museum have any of his artifacts at all? On the second floor, yes. Okay, good. There's a punch bowl there and a chair. Good. Yeah, I mean, Towanda was truly, at that time, one of the major focuses in the country as the Republican Party built. Everybody knew Towanda, Pennsylvania, because here's where David Wilmot was. Really interesting. Yeah. I believe it is it not? Yeah. It predates my days of, I've only been doing this through 2011. That marker's been there for a long, long time. And we were talking before, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is on part of his tombstone, which is just like, it's a remarkable thing. You know, the 13th Amendment hadn't passed that much before he died, but he wanted to ensure that he showed his legacy of support in ending slavery here in the United States. Amazing guy. Yeah?
How deep
He did it more from the political side as opposed to the day-to-day sort of things. I mean, there were people, that were doing all sorts of wonderful things in the abolitionist movement in the country, but they needed the politicians in Washington. And so by putting this proviso together, it was really the flashpoint. The country probably could have, for a number of additional decades, gone off and continued slavery. But this was one of the flashpoints that was really needed to bring about the spark that eventually came the Civil War. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all your kind attention. I really enjoyed being with you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Our next month's program is the history of St. Anne's Parish in Bentley Creek, and Mary Ellen Kuntz has spoken here before many times, so she will be here to present that. Help yourself to look around the museum, and David Wilmot, there are some things right upstairs in one of these cells right here. If you're interested in looking for those, feel free to check out the museum, and thank you again for coming.